So I'd like to now bring to the microphone our first speaker, Ms. Megan Cotter. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Vanessa. Okay, so as Vanessa mentioned, my name is Megan Cotter and I'm a genetic counsellor. And part of my role as a genetic counsellor is to meet with people with a personal or family history of cancer, to clarify if there's a strong genetic link to the cancers in the family. And this process involves gathering family history information, assessing if genetic testing is appropriate, facilitating genetic testing when appropriate, and then providing risk information to that person and their family members. And so today I'm going to focus more on genetics and ovarian cancer, and pull my slides up. And so as an overview of my talk, I'm going to provide an overview of genetics. I'm going to talk about inherited versus sporadic cancer and how we look at those things. I'm going to talk about genetics and ovarian cancer briefly, but my colleague Marion will discuss that in greater detail. And then I'm going to talk about the logistics side of things, so what genetic testing actually is, what it involves, and what genetic test results actually mean. And we also know that people have concerns about genetic testing, and two of the main concerns we receive feedback about are cost and insurance aspects of genetic testing. So I'll touch on those as well. So when talking about genetic testing, we're talking about examining the genetic material which is found in every cell of our bodies. This genetic material is called DNA, and DNA contains coding regions and non-coding regions. And the coding regions are called genes. And DNA is packaged into structures called chromosomes, and each cell of our body contains 46 chromosomes. And chromosomes come in pairs. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. And we inherit one copy from our mother and one copy from our father. So this means that we inherit 50% of our genetic material from our mother and 50% of our genetic material from our father. So genes are essentially recipes that make proteins, and proteins have various functions throughout our body that make it work as it should. When there's a spelling mistake in the recipe, or also known as a genetic fault or a mutation, this may cause an abnormal protein to be produced or no protein at all. And so this is what we're looking for when we do genetic testing, to see if there is a spelling mistake in the gene which stops it from working properly and producing an incorrect protein. And we know that some genes are responsible for cell growth, and when genetic faults accumulate in these genes, cancer may develop. So when we look at cancer, we look at it as whether it's inherited or sporadic. And it's important to be aware that all cancer, it can be seen as genetic, but it's also important to be aware that cancer doesn't develop just because of one fault in one gene. And so we know that cancer develops because of an accumulation of faults in multiple genes over time, which lead to uncontrolled cell growth. Now, this staircase diagram that you can see on the slide is a way to represent this. And it shows that each step represents the progression of genetic changes that develop in different cancer protection genes. And it shows the progression of a normal cell to becoming a cancerous cell. And so when people inherit a faulty gene in one of these cancer protection genes, it means that they start off on one of the higher steps. So it means they have an increased risk of developing cancer compared to someone in the general population. So that's just a brief overview of genetics and how we look at cancer and genetics. Now, thinking about ovarian cancer and genetics, we need to think about the subtypes of ovarian cancer. And we know that the majority of ovarian cancer, so about 90%, can be described as what's called epithelial ovarian cancer. And this means that it arises from the cells covering the ovary. And fallopian tube cancer and primary peritoneal cancer can also be classed under this epithelial ovarian cancer umbrella. There are other types of ovarian cancer, such as germ cell tumours and stromal cell tumours, but for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on epithelial ovarian cancer because we know that approximately 20% of women who have epithelial ovarian cancer have a genetic fault in one of these genes that increase the risk of developing ovarian cancer, so it's classed as hereditary. So the graph that you can see on this slide represents the genetic faults identified in women with epithelial ovarian cancer. So lots of studies have looked at the different types of genes that are in women with epithelial ovarian cancer. And in this study, we can see that the majority, so about 80% of these genetic faults identified in women with epithelial ovarian cancer are found in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. Now, faults in these genes are associated predominantly with an increased risk of developing breast and ovarian cancer. We can also see that a small proportion of genetic faults are identified in what's called the MMR genes, and these are the genes that are associated with Lynch syndrome. And Lynch syndrome predominantly increases the risk of developing bowel, uterine and ovarian cancer, but it can also increase the risk of developing other types of cancer. And there are also a significant number of faults identified in other genes. And separately, these genes don't account for a large proportion of hereditary ovarian cancer, but together they contribute a significant amount. But given they are less common, less is known about the specific risks associated with these genes, and they may not be tested for in a clinical setting. And I think Marian's going to go into a bit more detail about each of these types of genes and what they mean with respect to ovarian cancer. Now, the majority of the genes that are associated with ovarian cancer are inherited in what is called an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have two copies of every gene, one inherited from our mother and one inherited from our father. And when a gene is said to be inherited in a dominant pattern, this means you only need to inherit one faulty copy of the gene in order to be at risk of developing that condition. But most of these genes that increase the risk of developing ovarian cancer show variable penetrance and also variable expressivity. So what this means is that you may have an increased risk of developing cancer, but not everyone who inherits these genes develops cancer. And the type of cancer that may develop can also vary from person to person, even in the same family. So this family tree on the slide is a typical family tree of a family who have a BRCA1 genetic fault. And it's showing 3 generations. And what it shows is that the circles represent women and the squares represent men. And the black circles are those women who have had a diagnosis of ovarian cancer. So for example, the woman at the top had a diagnosis of ovarian cancer at the age of 49. And then the people who have inherited the BRCA1 genetic fault are shown by the positive sign next to the symbol. So as you can see, the type of cancer that develops and the age that it develops varies between family members. So we've got 2 women diagnosed with ovarian cancer at 49 and 53, and then also 2 women diagnosed with breast cancer at 42 and 38. And this also shows that the 2 women diagnosed with breast cancer at the bottom have inherited it from their mother and father who have not inherited, who have not developed cancer, but they do carry the gene. So sometimes it can look like a gene is skipping a generation, but this is not the case. It just demonstrates that a person can carry the genetic fault and not develop the cancer. And it's also important to be aware that men can carry these genes, but the cancer risks associated for men are much lower than they are for women. So what actually is genetic testing? So genetic testing involves the analysis of an individual's genetic material. And in a family cancer clinic, there are 2 main types of genetic testing that we think of when it comes to these cancer genes. And the first type of testing is called mutation detection or mutation searching. And this is essentially the process of looking for a spelling mistake in one of these cancer genes, which would explain the diagnosis of cancer in the family. And sometimes this can be likened to the process of trying to find a spelling mistake in an encyclopedia. So genes are made up of lots and lots of different letters, and that's when we're trying to find a spelling mistake in those letters, which has stopped the gene from working properly or not. This type of testing is most informative if it starts in someone who has had ovarian cancer or who's been affected by cancer. And then if a spelling mistake or a genetic fault is identified, then testing is much simpler in other relatives, as we know exactly what we're testing for, because each family has their own specific genetic fault. If testing is done for a specific genetic fault that's been identified in the family and that person has not had cancer themselves, that's what we call predictive genetic testing. And that's because we're testing someone and we're predicting what their risk of developing cancer is based on that genetic test result. So from a logistics side of things, genetic testing is usually done on a blood test. Sometimes it's done on other samples, but most of the time it's done on a blood test. And it's usually arranged through a family cancer clinic. So you would usually be referred to a family cancer clinic, and they would go through a consenting process and would facilitate that testing for you. However, some oncologists and surgeons have started to order genetic testing themselves to assist in treatment planning. Results can usually take up to 2 months, but sometimes they can come back quicker, and it can vary depending on the test ordered and the actual lab used. So what type of test will you be offered? So the type of genetic testing you would be offered depends on a number of things, including the age at diagnosis, your family history, and the pathology of cancers. But it may include one of the genes that I was talking about earlier, so say BRCA1 or 2, the Lynch syndromes, or some of these rare cancer genes. And testing has evolved rapidly, and we are now able to test lots of genes at the same time. So sometimes you might be offered a panel of genes, so testing for multiple of these genes at the same time. So should you have genetic testing? It's really important to be aware that you are not obligated to undergo genetic testing. It's completely voluntary, and the decision needs to be made taking into consideration all of your personal and family factors. And that's, I guess, what the conversation through the consenting process is about. It's about deciding whether this is the right time for you to have a genetic test. Some benefits around genetic testing, particularly in the area of ovarian cancer, include that it might inform current treatment options, it could inform future cancer risks, and it also provides information for unaffected relatives. We do know, however, that some people have concerns about genetic testing, and a survey conducted by Ovarian Cancer Australia revealed that some of the main concerns people have were around the timing of testing. So some people felt that it was just too much while they were undergoing treatment. And also some people are worried about the implications for other family members. And also two of the main concerns were people were concerned about the impact of insurance and also the cost of testing. So I'll touch on these. But it's important to be aware that if you do have concerns about testing and you're not quite sure if you want to go ahead, you may benefit from speaking to a genetic counsellor, as they'll be able to talk through those issues with you. So what does a genetic test reveal? So there are 3 possible outcomes with genetic testing. And that's the genetic testing I was talking about, where we're trying to find a genetic fault in a family. So the first outcome is a genetic fault or a mutation is identified, and this is what is called a positive result. So this means that a cause for the cancer in the family will have been identified. It also means that you may be at risk of developing other types of cancer, and it also means that your close relatives are able to have a test to clarify their risks of developing cancer. The second outcome, and this is the most common outcome with genetic testing, is that no genetic fault is identified. And this is what's called a negative result. This is because no cause for the diagnosis of cancer has been identified. And sometimes this type of result is called uninformative, as it is possible there may be another gene or other genetic factors that are influencing cancer risk in your family that we're currently unable to test for. And in this circumstance, we're unable to offer testing to other family members to clarify their risk of developing cancer, and we would use the family history as a way of assessing other family members' risks of developing cancer. And the third outcome with genetic testing is that we find a variant of uncertain significance. And this is still classed as a negative or an uninformative result, but what it means is that a spelling mistake has been identified in a gene, and it's not quite clear whether it stopped the gene from working properly or not. In this circumstance, we wouldn't offer testing to other family members to help clarify their risk of developing cancer, because we wouldn't want people to make decisions based on uncertain information. But it's important that if you do get a result, a variant of uncertain significant result through your genetic testing, it's important to keep in touch with your familial cancer clinic every few years, because our knowledge around these variants changes over time, and they would be able to update you on the current knowledge around the variant. Now, one of the most commonly asked questions is, how much does genetic testing cost? And as a general rule in Australia, women who have a greater than 10% chance of identifying a mutation or a genetic fault are eligible for a Medicare-funded genetic test. Now, some women automatically qualify for genetic testing based on their age and the pathology of their cancer, but some women will need to undergo an assessment to determine if they are eligible. And things that are taken into consideration are the age that people are diagnosed, the pathology, the ancestry, family history, and also family structure. Now, if you're assessed to have a less than 10% chance of identifying a genetic fault, there is the option of self-funding genetic testing. And this costs approximately $500, but prices can vary depending on what lab is used. And when I'm talking about this type of genetic testing, this is the testing that I was talking about with mutation searching or mutation detection. So it's important to be aware that if there is already a genetic fault identified in your family, then testing should be funded by your local family cancer clinic. Now, one of the other main concerns people have is about insurance. And these are some significant questions that we get asked. So it's important to be aware that health insurance cannot be impacted by genetic test results. They cannot change your level of cover or your premium based on your genetic test results. But genetic testing may impact the cost or terms of life and income protection insurance. So when applying for life or income protection insurance, you're not required to have a genetic test, but they may use a genetic test result in the assessment. There is a proposed moratorium or a ban on the use of genetic test results, and this is supposed to take effect in July 2019 until at least June 2024, but it's not guaranteed that this will take effect, and it is only up to a certain level of cover. So if you have specific concerns about insurance, we recommend that you contact your local financial advisor for more specific advice. But the key thing is that it can't impact health insurance. So where can you get more information? So these are some really good websites, and we'll put links on these to these websites on the Ovarian Cancer Australia website, and these are where you can get further information about genetics and ovarian cancer. But if you do have specific questions about genetic testing, I recommend you go to your doctor and ask for a referral to your local family cancer clinic. Thanks. So I think over to you, Vanessa. I think we'll open it up for some questions.
Sorry, yeah, thanks very much, Megan, for that extremely informative presentation. We do have a couple of questions that the audience has posted. Sure. One is, I think my sister had genetic testing before she passed away, but I'm not sure. How do I find out?
Sure. So it's really important that you get a referral from your GP to a local family cancer clinic, and they'll be able to look into this for you. So what they'll do is they'll probably gather some information about your family history just to update to see if there's been any further diagnoses since your sister passed away. And they'll also be able to contact the family cancer clinic where your sister was seen to get that information. And so if there's consent to release that genetic test result, they'll be able to access that, and they'll be able to, I guess, show what was tested for and what that means for your level of risk.
Great, thank you. And one more question. I have ovarian cancer, but haven't had testing yet. I don't live in a capital city, so am I able to still access genetic testing?
Yes, of course. So it would be important, once again, to get a referral to your local cancer clinic. And it's important to be aware that cancer clinics are all over Australia, so they're in every state, and they also provide outreach clinics and can conduct telehealth clinics. So there's a way of making it more accessible if you aren't able to go into a capital city. So.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much again, Megan, for joining this webinar. We really appreciate your time.